All right, so what we're going to look at here is taking a frequency table and then kind of going into the relative frequency, and we want to be able to create a relative frequency histogram, okay? So we want to be able to create kind of like we showed in the relative frequency video, that bar graph idea. That's called a histogram, okay? Now, this first example, with the superheroes, we're going to do that together in class. We'll kind of take like a little survey and see if we can take the relative, determine the frequency and then the relative frequency, and we'll create a histogram from that. So I'm actually going to drop down to this bottom example. And what we're given here, they already determined the frequency. We want to determine the relative frequency. So we're looking at an e-phone here, and it's talking about the battery life, okay? So it looks like we have, in terms of hours, anywhere from 8 hours to 12 hours, okay? And then it counts the frequency of the number of phones that fall within that range, okay? So from 8 hours to 8.5, we have 1. From 8.5 to 9, we have 2. From 9 to 9.5, we have 17, and so on. Okay, so the first thing we have to do in order to create our histogram is we first got to determine the relative frequency, like we talked about in the last video. So we need to total this up and determine how many in total of number of phones we're looking at. Okay, so with your calculator, or if you just want to count it off to the side, we can add it all together. 1 plus 2 plus 17 plus 30 plus 32 plus 15 plus 3 plus 0, and we would get that the total amount that we have here in terms of phones is 100. Okay, then remember to determine the relative frequency in terms of the total. Okay, that would be 1 phone out of every 100 phones, and if we divide that out, we would find that comes out to be 0.01. Okay, so the relative frequency there is 0.01, or you would say 1%. Okay, then we're going to do that for each one of these. So we'd have 2 out of 100, which would be 0.02. We'd have 17 out of 100, 0.17. 30 out of 100, that gives us our 30%, or 0.30. 32 out of 100, and we get 32%, or 0.32. We get 15 out of 100. Again, you can divide this in the calculator to 0.15, 15%, and then 3 out of 100. We get 0.03, 3%, and 0 out of 100, well, 0 divided by anything is 0, but for our purposes, I'm just going to write it in that same format, but it's essentially 0, okay, so 0%. Or it is 0, I shouldn't say essentially 0, but it is 0, okay? Now, once we determine the relative frequency there, then what we want to create is kind of like a vertical axis. Whoops, try that a little bit straighter. That's a little bit straighter. A vertical axis and a horizontal axis, okay, horizontal axis. And then from there, it's kind of like the idea of our coordinate plane. We have an x-axis and a y-axis. And then from there, we want to label the x-axis in terms of the actual battery life here. Okay, that's what we're going to be representing here in terms of the relative frequency, is we're talking about the battery life in hours. So in the x-axis, we're going to put this guy, okay, because that's what we're referring to, battery life. In terms of hours. Then on the y-axis, what we're going to put there is the relative frequency, okay? We're going to put the relative frequency because we want to know in terms of what is the relative frequency in each of these ranges, okay? So relative frequency, okay? So that's the first thing, is kind of labeling our axes. Okay. Now, what we're referring to is this has to do with the e-phone group. So you want to give it a title. Okay. So this is the battery life for the e-phone. Okay. That's what we're referring to in this table. Is we're talking about the various battery life for the e-phone. Okay, out of 100 phones. Okay, so that's the first few things we want to want to do in making this histogram, okay? Creating our vertical axis, our horizontal axis, and then labeling our axes. So this is our battery life in hours. That's what we're referring to. That's what this whole table is about. Then on the y-axis, that's going to be our relative frequency. And then, of course, it's good to give this a title as well. We're talking about the battery life of the e-phones, okay? That's the title of our histogram, okay? Then we can start to actually determine how we're going to spread out our given information. How are we going to label in terms of what do we want to use in terms of how to spread out the data for relative frequency? Do we want to count, let's say, by 5%? Do we want to count by 10%? Okay, those kind of things. Well, actually, I'm going to focus on the horizontal axis first, and these are the different classes that we're dealing with, okay? So we're going anywhere from 8 to 12. Now, I'm going to show you a couple different ways we can label this, and then we'll come back and pick on one of these. One way we could label this, let's see, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, 1, 2. Might kind of running out of room here. Might have to make these a little bit smaller. Okay. One way we can label this. Kind of running out of room. Okay, but we have to have 8 of these since we have 8 of these classes here. Okay. One way that is very common is they just take this range of values here, and that's what they're going to mark underneath. So they would say 8.0 to 8.5, okay? Then the next one would be 8.5 to 9, okay? And then the next one, we would go with the third guy, which would be 9.0 to 9.5, okay? That's a common way that you might see things labeled, okay? That's one approach that we can take. Now, another approach we can take, let's say we didn't want to do that. Another approach we can take is we can just start with this guy, and then the next one would be this guy, and so on, all the way till we get to 12, okay? So we could label it, if we didn't want to go that way, we could label it as 8.0, and then we could go 8.5, that's the next one, 8.5, okay, so just kind of going off of our chart here, 8.0 to 8.5. Then the next one would be 9.0, 9.5. Then we could go 10, 10.5, 11, 11.5. Again, kind of running out of room here, but 11.5. And then all the way to this end tick mark, we would have 12, okay? So that's another common way that you'll see it labeled. And actually on your test, this is probably the way that they're going to have you label it, okay? So we're just labeling based on what they have here. So we go from 8 to 12, and they're counting by 0.5. So 8, 8.5, 9, 9, 9.5, 10, 10.5, 11, 11.5, and 12. So that's one way we can label this, okay? Then going on the vertical axis now, we want to go from 0, and then we want to include all the relative frequencies, all these percentages that we labeled here, okay? So we just have to figure out what we want to count by. When I look at this, we're going anywhere from 0 to 32%, correct? So for me, I'm thinking if we count by 5 percentage points, we'll probably be fine, okay? So I'm actually going to go from, try to make that a little smaller. I'm going to go from 0 here to 0.05, 5%, and then I'm going to go 0.10, 10%, 0.15, 15%, 0.20, 20%, 0.25, 0.30, 30%, and then lastly, maybe a little bit, there we go. Lastly, 0.35, 35%, okay? And then if we count by these 5 percentage points, that includes all the values that we had listed in our relative frequency, okay? So that's the first steps that we want to take here, okay? So we had a horizontal axis, we have our vertical axis, we labeled our axes, we titled our histogram, and then we counted out how we're going to space things in terms of the vertical and the horizontal, okay? Now, the next thing we want to do is actually create, in a sense, it's like a bar graph, the bars that represent how much we have of each relative frequency here, okay? Now, the thing with a histogram, though, is that we don't space out the bars, okay? So from 8 to 8.5, we're at 1%. So we're going to find where it would be about 1% in our graph, which looks maybe like here, and we're going to create a bar, maybe just slightly lower actually. There we go. A bar to represent that's 1%, okay? And it might actually be even slightly lower, but I'm just kind of running out of space here. Then the next one, from 8.5 to 9, it looks like 2%, so just maybe slightly higher, okay? Just slightly higher. Maybe it should be just slightly lower, but it's a little bit off because I'm hand drawing this, okay? And then on from 9 to 9.5, we're going to 17%. 17%, maybe we're about right there, okay, for 17%. And then from 9.5, so that was 17%. From 9.5 to 10, looks like we're at 30%. So we're going to draw a bar all the way to 30%, which looks about right there. Oops. Try that again. Okay. And then from 10 to 10.5, from 10 to 10.5, we're at 32%, so just a little bit higher. Just a little bit higher. Maybe about right there. Okay. And then from 10.5 to 11, we're at 15%. We're at 15%, so just a little lower than the green bar there. Okay. And then looking at 11 to 11.5, we're at 3%, so just slightly higher than our last blue bar. Okay. And then the last bar, we're at 0%, so we don't even have to draw a bar there because it's at 0. So from 11.5 to 12, we're at 0, so there's no bar there. Okay. But this would be our relative frequency histogram. Okay, so notice we have an x-axis, a y-axis, or you could just say horizontal axis and a vertical axis. We labeled both of what they are. We were talking about the various battery lives. Okay, that's what these represent, 8 hours, 8.5, all the way to 12 hours. Then we labeled the relative frequency histogram with the percentages we found. We titled our histogram, and then we graphed our bars. Okay, so this would represent the data that we were given. Okay.